Welcome to Broadcasting Scotland, a special report. This is the first edition of our new programme, and we are focusing on the two-child policy and the consequent rape clause introduced by the last Conservative government. First put in the Chancellor's 2015 summer budget, the two-child policy, as described by the Conservative Party, is a cap on tax credits, which will allow people on benefits to make the same choices as those supporting themselves solely through work. When questioned on the policy in Parliament, the Conservative government introduced an exception for children conceived from non-consensual sex, the so-called rape clause. To claim this exemption, a woman must declare to a third party that she has been raped. To prove this, a woman must fill out an 8-page form which stipulates her name, the name of her child, and that she is no longer living with an abusive partner in a coercive relationship. A third party has to judge whether or not this is a true claim and that the circumstances are consistent with the child being born as a result of non-consensual sex. Opponents of the two-child policy have denounced this as a grotesque violation of human rights, which poses a threat to the safety of women and children in the grips of domestic violence. To date, the two-child policy has not been debated in Westminster, despite active and dedicated campaigning led by Alison Thewlis and her colleagues over the past 22 months.
It's 21 months, everybody, since the UK government snuck out in the summer budget that they were going to limit tax credits to the first two children and that they were going to make women who have been raped prove that in order to claim tax credits. Over the past 21 months, I have raised this again and again. I asked David Cameron, I asked George Osborne, I asked Ian Duncan Smith, I asked Theresa May, I asked Philip Hammond, Damien Green, Damien Hines, Caroline Knox. Every single one of them has been unable to answer why this policy is justified, why women should have to prove that their child was born as a result of rape. It is a policy they cannot justify. It's vile, it's cruel, and it stigmatises not just the women, but those children too. Can you imagine? Imagine how dreadful it would be to find out that that was the circumstances that you came into this world. The government has no right to do that to children in this country. It is appalling. This government has also proven time and time again that they don't understand domestic violence. They don't understand coercive control. They don't understand the circumstances that women are living in. For one of the government ministers to tell me in a meeting that women should just flee belies how little they know about the dangers that women are put in. They need to know and they need to hear from people just how despicable this policy is. But it's not just the rape clause, it's the family cap as well. They want to limit tax credits and the child element of universal credit to the first two children in a family. That says to people, we only value those first two children. We make a judgment on the life that you live, on the choices that you make. That is not acceptable in a free society. There are 870,000 families that have 3 or more children. The majority of those families are in work because tax credits are about supporting those who are in work, who do work, who are trying hard. They're the very just about managing people that Theresa May claims she wants to support. The result of this is a loss of £2,800 per family, per child, as a result of this policy. This is going to push 200,000 children into relative poverty by 2020. This government knows this. This government is doing this deliberately, and it is not on. With the family cap, they don't take into account blended families, families who've come together from two separate relationships, which happens very often. They're making families say, okay, we don't value this child that's come from this relationship. People are going to lose out as a result of coming together through love and coming into new families. It's going to stigmatise people from ethnic minorities, people from religious faith groups who will be disproportionately affected by the family cap. It is punishing people for the circumstances they are in that they can do nothing about. They can do nothing about their circumstances, but this government is passing judgment on how much money they're worth. That is unacceptable. And I want to talk just a little bit today about the Tories in Scotland and their ridiculous position on the rape clause and the two-child policy. Because Ruth Davidson has been absolutely cowardly on this. First of all, she hid behind her spokesperson. She wouldn't even come out and make a statement herself. She hid behind her spokesperson and says, "Oh, I agree with my..." Aye, she's a lot less brave when she's not on a tank. You're quite right, Janie Godley. And just this afternoon she said, oh, the Scottish Government should just mitigate it. Mitigate it! Mitigate it! If she thinks it's worth mitigating, she should get on the phone to Theresa May. She should get on the phone to her and say, scrap the two-child policy, scrap the rape clause and do it now. Because this isn't just about women and children and families in Scotland. It's not. It's about families the length and breadth of the UK. It's about the judgment that this Tory government is putting on them. For women in Northern Ireland, if they go and confess that they've been raped by somebody, that person is obliged to tell the police. That's putting women in direct danger for women in Northern Ireland, and that's something the UK government is not addressing either. We need to protect women in England, in Wales, in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. The women's movement in Scotland has been fantastic on this. Women's organisations in Scotland across the board have said, we disagree with this policy. We will not be part of implementing this policy. We will not help women fill in this form that says, support for a child conceived without your consent. We will not make different parts of our sectors of our society that the UK government relies on to bring this in. They say they weren't consulted and they want no part of it either. So we must come together, we must keep the pressure on the UK government, and we must resist this attack on families here and everywhere. Thank you all very much for coming along.
A demonstration held on the 13th of April to coincide with the launch of the official petition to scrap the rape clause and the family cap on social security payments brought widespread public support in Scotland.
Alison, I'm really pleased, has acknowledged the cross-party support, including those who don't support independence. You know, this is an issue, whether you support independence or not, you need to see the injustice of what the Tory government is doing at the moment. So there are Labour and Green and SNP and others who've joined together, and we need to continue to join together in both parliaments to oppose what the Tory government is doing. Obviously, many of us here, not just in this crowd but elsewhere, would see independence as part of the solution, giving Scotland the ability to build a welfare system of its own from scratch. But from where we are now, it's unacceptable to say we're going to wait until that battle's been won.
The petition itself gained over 25,000 signatures. However, due to the announcement of a snap election, parliamentary rules required the petition to stop early on the 3rd of May, before Parliament dissolved. Responding to public support for the campaign, the Scottish Parliament debated the two-child policy on the 25th of April.
Presiding Officer, I begin by moving the motion in my name. Last Thursday, together with Kezia Dugdale, Willie Rennie, Patrick Harvey and many MSPs from across this chamber, I attended the demonstration against the rape clause which took place outside this building. At that demonstration, Sandy Brindley of Rape Crisis Scotland said, the opposition to the rape clause is not about party politics, it is about basic human rights, and I agree very much with that. Of course, the rape clause has come about because of the two-child cap introduced 3 weeks ago by the UK government. That cap means that child tax credits and universal credit will only be paid for 2 children in each family. Now, I'll talk about the rape clause in due course, but it is worth noting that the policy intention of these changes, not an inadvertent consequence, but the intention behind them, is to reduce the income of low-wage families with children.
Politics is a life we choose because we think we can do some good. More than that, it's because we think that it's our opinions, our views about life, are those which should shape the world that we live in, which could help those who feel left behind, forgotten or are struggling, and give them a voice and a belief that their opinions also count. Yes, we are all here in this chamber because we are in the business of doing good. What an ideal. What an absolute joke in the eyes of the Scottish Conservative Party. For 10 years, the Tory government at Westminster has slashed at our valued social security system in a deliberate act of sabotage. And the question I would have put to Ruth Davidson, if she had bothered to take any interventions, is a question of judgement. Tell us why rape victims have to pay the price of the deficit whilst you give tax cuts to the richest people in our society. The disabled, the poor, the ill, the carers of our society have all been victims of Tory austerity. And not content with that, the Tories have now turned their grasping, grubby, miserly attention to the tax credit system, one of Labour's finest achievements. Is there no end to the Tories' desire to ensure those with the least have even less? And as the casual victims of this clawing meanness, women who have 2 children, who have had a third as a result of a rape, are now at the mercy of the harsh diktats of a government intent on dismantling the vital safety net of benefits. Either admit to being raped and having a child born of this physically, mentally, emotionally scarring crime and get the financial help you need, or go without. Without doubt, the Tories' family cap is arbitrary and unfair, and the rape clause which accompanies it is utterly horrific and abhorrent.
The issue of the so-called rape clause arose as a result of the welfare bill passed in the House of Commons in 2015. And these changes to welfare spending were introduced in the wake of the 2015 general election, when my party set out its manifesto, a clear plan to try and put the UK's public finances back on solid ground. We all know that the UK continues to spend more than it can afford, last year borrowing to the tune of £69 billion. It is the view of these benches that in order to restore public finances, we must eliminate that deficit and then reduce the debt mountain that we as a country has allowed to build up over a period of years. Otherwise, future generations will have to pay our debts. I'm sorry, I have a lot to get through and I won't be taking any interventions. I also don't think that this issue is one that should be subject to the knockabout that we see and hear daily. Now, this, of course, is a political judgement that any government has to take. Labour and the SNP would not seek to curtail the growth in spending as we would, and that is their right. But it is our judgement that we need to reduce this deficit in order to demonstrate that the UK can withstand any future shocks that may come our way and can build an economy which continues to sustain our public services. And this inevitably means examining many budgets, and the welfare budget is included in that. And it has meant, for example, removing child benefit from higher earners. But the issue that we are debating today revolves around the further decisions taken by the UK Government to limit child tax credits to the first 2 children.
At the Holyrood debate, Ruth Davidson, leader of the Scottish Conservatives, was condemned for her support of the 2-child policy.
How did the Tories get themselves into a position of defending a clause that is now and forever will be known as the rape clause? How did the Tory leader find herself in full flow this afternoon for, I think, about 2 minutes discussing the inadequacies of the criminal justice system for rape victims? How is it that they now find themselves at odds with all the agencies who would be the third parties meant to report and administer it? How is it that any right-thinking person could ask the agencies to judge whether a woman has been raped that has not gone to court? You could not make it up.
When we spoke to Jean Freeman, Scottish Government Minister for Social Security, she condemned the Scottish Conservative Party's support for the 2-child policy as indefensible.
The surprise for me, I think that the Scottish Parliament showed itself to be, as a majority, a Parliament that is capable of political parties coming together when they are confronted with something that they believe is fundamentally wrong. The surprise, if you like, is that our Tory colleagues in that Parliament insist in apologising for something that they must know is indefensible. And I think their behaviour is shameful and scandalous, and they continue to apologise and squirm in the face of that behaviour. But their interest is in defending the UK Tory government much more than it ever is standing up for people in Scotland.
Alison Throulis has been at the forefront of the campaign to scrap the two-child policy and the consequent rape clause. We spoke to her about the development of the campaign.
Well, I mean, the start came in George Osborne's summer budget in July 2015. So my general practice and things, having been 8 years in Glasgow City Council, is to start at the back of any document and sort of flick through to see what they've hidden at the back. So I'm flicking through, and I get to, I think it's about page 88, and it has this phrase which says about restricting child tax credits to the first two children and exemptions in cases of rape. And I went, wait a minute here, what is this? And nudge my colleague next door. Does that mean what I think it means? And they're going, yeah, we think that means that means what you think it means. So from that point, I was asking questions about that. I'm saying, well, how are you going to make women evidence that they've been raped? If you're saying that there's an exception for it, what does that mean? And also about the wider two-child restriction as well. How does that work? How will that affect families that are maybe coming together from two separate families coming together? How will that affect families that maybe for traditional religious reasons might have larger families as well? How will that affect them? What impact will that have? Have you done any assessment, UK government, on this policy? And the more that I asked, the less information they seemed to have, the less idea that they seemed to have about this policy, which I found hugely worrying and hugely frustrating. So from that point onwards, I sort of took that upon myself to ask questions to try and find out more about this policy, because the more that I looked at it, the more unworkable and the more unfair it seemed to be.
The outgoing Conservative government's declared objective for the two-child policy was to reduce the deficit and rebalance public spending by cuts to the welfare budget.
In the summer budget of 2015, the Chancellor George Osborne set out his plans for changes to the welfare bill. 18 months on, starting on the 6th of April of this year, child tax credits were limited to the first two children in the family. I'd like to note that for those families with 3 children or more and currently receiving tax benefits, their benefits will not be reduced. I'd also like to set out the reasons for the changes. Firstly, following spiralling spending by a previous Labour administration, concerted efforts have been made by a Conservative government to reduce public deficit and rebalance welfare spend, to restore fairness in the benefit system between those receiving benefits and those paying for them, with families relying on welfare support to make the same financial decisions as those supporting themselves solely through work.
Critics say that while reducing the deficit is a reasonable objective, doing this at the expense of the most vulnerable in society is unfair and will result in an increase in child poverty. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission believe that the two-child policy breaches the UN Convention and the Rights of the Child in Articles 3 and 27, which state that children have the right to adequate living standards. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child recommend that the UK Government revise the 2016 Welfare Reform and Work Act in order to fully respect the right of the child to have his or her best interests taken as primary consideration, taking into account the different impacts of the reform on groups of children, particularly those in vulnerable situations. In a briefing paper by Policy and Practice, they have warned that 2.1 million families are at risk if they have another child. 70% of these families are in work. They estimate as a result of the two-child policy, up to 8,000 children will lose support of up to £2,780. Analysis by the Child Poverty Action Group and the Institute of Public Policy Research has found that once universal credit is fully rolled out, the two-child policy will result in up to 200,000 additional children in poverty. This represents an increase of more than 10% in child poverty. We asked Scottish Social Security Minister Jean Freeman whether she felt the two-child policy and rape clause was in keeping with a fair social security system in Scotland.
For me, social security is a rights-based approach, that it is an investment we all make in ourselves and in each other, and the social security system we will have in Scotland will be one that is rights-based and that is founded on the principles of dignity, fairness and respect. And the UK government's child tax policy, which includes the rape clause, fundamentally contradicts that. And so for me, if we had the choice in Scotland, but we don't, because that policy remains reserved to the UK government, we would never for 1 minute countenance the introduction of the child tax policy, far less the rape clause or any of the other components of it.
Ruth Davidson stated that she believes that the misinformation surrounding the rape clause is the reasoning behind the hostility towards the two-child policy. We asked Pauline McNeill to respond to this belief.
So Ruth Davidson's been alleging that other parties have been scaring the public by misinforming people about the rape clause. No, in fact, she is misinforming people about the rape clause. We've all read through the guidance line by line. It's quite clear that you have to come forward, you have to complete a fairly lengthy forum, and then you have to report it to a third-party agency. It's an absurd policy. And in fact, you know, if you talk to any woman, it's a very sensitive issue. Or organisations that deal with women who have been raped, it's not very likely those women are going to come forward in any case. And in many cases they haven't come forward in the first place to report that rape, so it's very unlikely they're going to do it in those circumstances. I think what the Tories have done in inventing something is an exception to the rule for the two-child policy, and they've ended up undermining their policy, which I don't support anyway. So now they're defending the rape clause, and what they wanted to talk about was why they'd reduced the policy of support to only 2 children for child benefit, and they haven't been able to do that. So all the time discussing the rape clause.
Christina McKelvey also criticised the word awkward used by Deputy Leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Jackson Carlow, when talking about the rape clause exemption.
There is one part of this policy which is perhaps the most disgusting thing we have seen from the Tories yet. And I'm talking about the so-called rape clause, their one exemption to their 3 strikes and you're out tax policy. This clause is nothing less than a barbaric assault on women who have suffered the life-changing consequences of having had a child as a result of non-consensual sex. My tenacious colleague Alison Hewlett MP found this rape clause buried in the welfare reform some 21 months ago. But this Tory government has ignored all of her calls for sense and even compassion to prevail. Their very own Jackson Carlow has described the policy as awkward. Awkward for who, Mr Carlow? For your Tory party hoping to slip this through without the inconvenience of arousing hostile public interest? For you, Ruth Davidson, and your other colleagues now performing excruciating contortions in a bid to sidestep responsibility for this barbarism? Well, I say to Mr Carlow and Ms Davidson, let the members of your side of this chamber hear this. For those who will find themselves trapped, humiliated and impoverished by this vicious and punitive piece of sophistry, it is a good deal more than awkward. It is devastating. Imagine if you or a member of your family find yourself already having suffered a rape or through domestic violence having to deal with this. To allow the state to use an 8-page form, and yes, it's an 8-page form, to snoop into the deepest recesses of your hurt and your trauma. Imagine, if you will, if you didn't report that rape because you just want to bury that awful memory, much like the person Kezia Dugdale spoke about. Imagine if you're still living with that abused partner who raped you. Imagine if you're in Northern Ireland and your application results in a report to the police. Imagine if you are that child named on that form. Well, we don't have to imagine, do we? This is not some dystopian story we are talking about. It's actual government policy, right here, right now, in this so-called civilised United Kingdom. This is deeper than disgusting. It is deliberate, calculated attack, not just on women who so often bear the brunt of Tory welfare cuts, but on their human rights as well.
In the year 2015-2016, there were 1,692 rapes, 117 attempted rapes, and 10,273 sexual offences that were reported to the police. That's an increase of 7% from the previous year. Research shows that the number of women reporting rape and sexual offences to the police are a small fraction of the total number of women affected by such crimes. During the Holyrood debate, Scottish Labour Party leader Kezia Dugdale read out a letter from a rape survivor who recounts her own ordeal and the way that the rape clause would have affected her in her situation.
But here is someone who is brave. I have a letter from a woman who wrote to me to tell her story about a rape and how this barbaric policy would have affected her. I have her permission to read it in full, and I have only removed references to the child's gender and the child's age. The Tories may not want to listen to me, but they surely cannot ignore her. This is what she had to say. 4 years ago, one of my closest friends, someone I trusted, raped me. It happened once. I used emergency contraception, but still fell pregnant. For lots of reasons, I decided I couldn't terminate the pregnancy and went on to have a baby. The speculation about the father was awful. I accepted that I would be labelled sexually promiscuous as a result. I was prepared for that. I expected and received horrendous treatment from my husband's family. I was prepared for that. I was prepared for the financial hardship, having just been made redundant. I was as prepared as I could be for life as a single parent. What I wasn't prepared for was the impact the labelling would have on my 3 existing children, born into wedlock and brought up in a stable family home. I wasn't prepared for the shame that I would feel. I wasn't prepared for the fear of anyone finding out and refusing to believe me. I wasn't prepared for the feeling that suicide was the only way out. I certainly wasn't prepared for the amount of hatred and resentment that I would feel for my own child. Years on, I have a happy, healthy child. They are worshipped, not just by me, but my extended family, and even better, my husband, a brave and loving man. My child doesn't know where they came from, and if I have anything to do with it, they never will. Nobody knows, aside from me, my husband, and the mental health nurse who helped me through this living hell. Though far from perfect, and with challenges of its own, I hope the secrecy will give them the chance to live as close to a normal life as possible. There have been so many pleas to take legal action or to widen the circle of trust to allow those who love me to provide support during the difficult times. But this is a risk I could never take. My need to protect my children from the truth came above all other considerations. The wider the circle of midwives, consultants, family, the less chance I had of protecting myself and my children from the permanent and damaging stigma attached to rape. I claimed tax credits from birth to 11 months old, the hand-up I needed when I was at my most vulnerable to allow me to restabilise my family. Tax credits kept our heads above water, a buffer between us and the food bank. For that, I am eternally grateful. There is no way I could complete that awful form of shame, no matter what the consequences. Looking back, that really could have been the thing that tipped me completely over the edge. The difference between surviving to tell the tale or not. That is the reality of the Tory rape clause, or the awful form of shame, as she puts it. That is the burden this Tory government wants to put on victims of rape because it doesn't want to pay for more than 2 children in a poor family. It is an absolutely sickening state of affairs. But it's not the author of that letter or any other rape victim who should feel shame. It is those on the Tory benches here and in Westminster who refuse to act.
Jean Freeman believes that the 2-child policy and so-called rape clause are undeliverable.
The other thing about this policy is that it is so ill thought through. There has been limited consultation, very little, if any, in Scotland at all. It is not clear, and the DWP doesn't know, who are going to be these apparent third-party assessors when we have women's organisations in gender, rape crisis, Women's Aid, saying that they will not act as third-party assessors to this policy. We have the Royal College of Nursing saying there are serious ethical questions for them in terms of their professional code as to whether or not they would be willing to support this policy. So the policy itself currently is undeliverable.
To date, there are no organisations in Scotland willing to participate as third-party verifiers for the rape clause. Sandy Brindley of Rape Crisis Scotland has stated, "It should go without saying that government policy should actively protect women who have experienced violence or abuse, rather than risking re-traumatising victims of rape and coercion by forcing them to disclose in order to receive benefits." Sandy went on to say that a choice between potential poverty or being forced to disclose rape is no choice at all.
I think this policy would never have been implemented in Scotland. I think the Scottish Government and the Parliament have a good track record on violence against women and combating violence against women. I am so disappointed at this policy being implemented by the Westminster Government. I never thought it would go ahead when there's such widespread resistance to it. And also I think just people are really upset that this is what we're willing to put women through just to access benefits.
Agreeing that this policy makes no consideration of women in coercive relationships, Marcia Scott, Chief Executive of Scottish Women's Aid, explained why Scottish Women's Aid have refused to participate as third-party verifiers.
The family cap, first of all, is enormously problematic for an organization like ourselves. It works with women who suffer from a lack of time, of poverty, of safety, and then to have a policy that goes in that's going to absolutely push more women and children into poverty, when we know that probably the single biggest reason that women struggle to get out of domestic abuse is because they need to find a way to pay for their legal services, to pay their rent, to put food on the table for their kids. So that whole context for us is also now the state's controlling one more aspect, just like men control women in the context of domestic abuse and children. So that's the background, obviously, to the whole notion of the family cap, which of course there's no evidence to support does what the officials think it's going to do. But then when you layer over top of that, which was what was clearly a policy, I think, response, a sort of knee-jerk response to, somebody's going to criticize this family cap by saying, what about women who've been raped? And then they developed this policy, that the rape clause exemption, which is so fundamentally at odds with the dynamics of rape and sexual assault and domestic abuse and a social security system that's supposed to be helping women and children rather than victimizing them. So to be honest, we were gobsmacked at the beginning. And then the underhandedness of the way the policy was not debated in Westminster, the guidance around the family cap and the rape clause came out at midnight on the night that Donald Trump was inaugurated. It's just a whole series of policy decisions made by people who clearly don't understand women and children's experiences of rape and sexual assault and domestic abuse, and when they were told that they obviously didn't care. It's not the form itself, it's the act of asking somebody to disclose, of forcing somebody to disclose, of forcing somebody to name when they're not willing to name their child, to name what's happened to them, to an official who's potentially had absolutely no training in how to respond to it. The act of rape and domestic abuse is all about taking control away from women. It's all about restricting their choices. And here is a policy that just takes that lack of control and forces it once again onto somebody who's really desperately trying to get control back.
The two-child policy is widely viewed as a policy from another century, and it has been condemned as an attack on women's rights.
I think it's a direct violation of the human rights of women and children, and ultimately incredible hypocrisy on the part of an administration that with one hand says they oppose violence against women and indeed actually supported the move to ratify the Istanbul Convention, which is a fabulous piece of policy on violence against women, on, believe it or not, on the same day. So that Istanbul Convention bill had its third reading in the Lords on the same day that the rape clause and Social Security family cap policy went into effect. And so this is absolutely hypocrisy to say that we're opposed to violence against women on one hand, while we're essentially practicing violence against women and children on the other.
One of the great disadvantages and worrying aspects of the policy is, aside from the immediate harm and damage it will do to women, particularly women who have already been traumatised by rape, and to any child that is born as a consequence of that rape, who will be named in the policy and is required to be named. Aside from the damage that it will do to those women and those children, the cap itself damages families and children. But in addition, in its complete misunderstanding of the importance of women's rights and children's rights, it rolls us back decades. This is a fundamental attack on some of the advances that we've achieved as women, as feminists, over decades. And we cannot allow to have that limited progress rolled back by a Tory government or by any government. And the apologists for it here in Scotland really should be fundamentally ashamed of themselves.
There is special concern in Northern Ireland, where the law requires that anyone with knowledge of a crime having been committed must report it to the police. This has necessitated a special form to be used in Northern Ireland with a prominent warning that the third-party verifier would be required to report a rape to the police. Jan Melia, the Chief Executive of Women's Aid in Northern Ireland, believes that the Social Security Amendment Regulations 2017 display a breathtaking lack of understanding of sexual violence and callous disregard for the well-being of victims. As she goes on to express that it will force women, the victims of rape, to choose between poverty and stigmatising their child as a rape child. Dr. Marcia Scott explains how this threat of police involvement puts women and children in even greater danger of social and economic disadvantages.
To require that women who would be claiming this exemption under the context of non-consensual conception would not be living with their perpetrator completely flies in the face of everything that we know about the fact that that women are in more danger of being murdered, and their children also, in the context of trying to leave a relationship. So even better set of choices for women. So you get to declare that your child was conceived in rape, but in order to do so, in order to feed that child, you have to leave the perpetrator and put yourself and that child at even more risk. So it's a Sophie's choice, and it's just another clear example of the distance between reality and competence in the writing of this policy and the outcome that it's likely to deliver for women and children.
Despite the last Conservative government claiming that the family cap was a fair measure intended to cut the welfare bill, the two-child policy and consequent rape clause have been roundly condemned by opponents as an unnecessary measure which will result in an increase in child poverty and put women and children at greater risk of being trapped in abusive, coercive relationships. According to experts who specialise in domestic abuse, the rape clause is simply undeliverable, as they believe no woman will subject herself to the application process.
Now, every time we raise these sorts of issues in the House of Commons, the answer we get from the Prime Minister is that it was the Conservative Party that gave the UK their first female Prime Minister, that it was the Conservative Party that gave the UK the second female Prime Minister, Well, let me say very clearly, as a woman, your gender doesn't matter a jot if you use it to kick away the ladder for other women.